न्यू लाइसियम फॉर इंग्लिश लिटरेचर प्लेटफॉर्म पर आपका स्वागत है आपके यूट्यूब चैनल पर। टुडे थर्ड क्लास है मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड पर। इन द फर्स्ट क्लास आई डिस्कस्ड मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड्स प्राइमरी क्रिटिसिज्म, इन द सेकंड वी डिस्कस्ड the function of criticism, and in the third class today we are going to discuss Matthew Arnold's essay The Study of Poetry. The Study of Poetry was published as the first essay of his essay on criticism's second series, and in fact it was published as an introduction to an anthology of poetry. An anthology of poems was published by whom? The essay was originally published as the introduction to T.H. Ward's The Anthology, The English Poets. The first question here on your screen: when was the essay Study of Poetry published? It was originally published as the introduction to T.H. Ward's Anthology, The English Poets, in 1880. Right, in 1880 it was published as an introduction to an anthology, to a collection of poems written by several English poets starting from the neoclassical era to the present day. And Matthew Arnold was asked to write an introduction, write a preface, and then he wrote The Study of Poetry, right, as an introduction to an 1880 anthology called The English Poets. And in it he refines his answers to what he considered the most important questions facing literary critics and readers. कई questions उठाए इन्होंने। पहला जैसे कि उसमें से question था, what function does poetry serve in modern society? What function does poetry serve in modern society? This was the one question. Another question was that what kind of poetry is best suited to serve these functions, and then what distinguishes truly excellent poetry from merely good poetry, and how can readers learn to recognize classical poetry, and how can reader differentiate between modern poetry and classical poetry? What kind of poetry is best suited to serve these functions? What distinguishes truly excellent poetry from merely good poetry, and how can readers learn to recognize classical poetry when they see it? And behind Arnold's questions and the answers he gives to them, readers can discern the central principle that defines his views on culture and society. And as you know that Mr. Matthew Arnold was a cultural critic, he was a sociological critic, he was the founder of sociological school of criticism. His entire focus is still on society, and he thinks everything as a social being things. उस हिसाब से सोचते हैं, right? Transcendent excellence does exist. Poetry is where it can be found, and people should strive to honor it. अगर हम पूरे को समराइज करें, इन अ नटशेल बात करें, तो अर्नल्ड आर्ग्यूज दैट पोएट्री इज यूनिकली एक्सीलेंट आर्ट फॉर्म, एंड दैट ड्यू टू इट्स वर्च्यूज इट हैज हाई डेस्टिनी, राइट? इट इज द एक्सीलेंट सॉर्ट ऑफ आर्ट, excellent art form, and due to its virtues it has a high destiny in human affairs. Since this destiny touches on the highest aspirations of human beings, nothing but the highest standards will do, and readers must train themselves to uphold these standards. Readers must have the standards if they want to read poetry. Writers must have standard if they want to write poetry. And what are the standards for poets? What are the standards for readers? इसकी बात करते हैं. How to judge a piece of poetry? इसकी बात करते हैं Matthew Arnold in this essay. In this essay, he talks about the primary जो ऑब्जेक्टिव है पोएट्री का, वो दैट इज हाई सीरियसनेस, मोरालिटी, उसकी बात करते हैं. एंड ही suggests the ways to estimate, to evaluate a piece of poetry, who should be a great poet and who should not be a great poet, and what are the parameters to become a great poet, and what are the parameters to write high and serious poem. Why Mr. Geoffrey Chaucer is not a serious poet, why he lacks high seriousness, and what are the features of Robert Burns, why is he a minor poet, right? Why Alexander Pope and Dryden is called, they are called basically the prose classics instead of poetry classics, though they were writing poetry, they were much expert in poetry. Why 18th century is called our indispensable age, our indispensable 18th century, and here only he says that 18th century is the age of prose and reason. In this essay he talks about his theory of Touchstone method. So we are going to discuss all these points here today. First question here, the essay was published as an introduction, as a preface to T.H. Ward's anthology of poems under the title The English Poets, and it was published in 1880, and in 1888 it was included, it became the first essay in the essay on criticisms, essay in criticisms second series. Alright, now back to your main issue. I told you the basic questions. What should be the future of poetry? And on this future of poetry, Mr. Arnold says that the future of poetry is immense, because in poetry, where it is worthy of its high destinies, our race as times goes on will find an ever surer and surer stay. आपको याद होगा, in the previous class I had talked about the environment of Victorian period, and according to Matthew Arnold, Victorian environment was not suitable to write poetry, to write excellent poetry, and that's why Matthew Arnold had suggested that the basic purpose of criticism is to learn and propagate the best that is thought and known in the world. Right here once again he says the basic thing is this atmosphere, this environment is not suitable for poetry. So the future of poetry is not critical, future is immense, right? It gives us pleasure, it will save us, right? Where it is worthy of its high destinies, our race as time goes on will find an ever surer and surer stay. But for Matthew Arnold, the basic thing for poetry is idea. Idea is everything. Idea is permanent, and that permanency is called poetry. For poetry, the idea is everything. This is the quotation from his essay. For poetry, idea is everything. The rest is the world of illusion. And this idea is everything was stated by Plato. And apart from the idea, everything was mimesis for Plato, and for Matthew Arnold, everything is illusion. Mimesis and illusions are synonymous here for Matthew Arnold. Right? Of divine illusion, poetry attaches its emotion to the idea. The idea is the fact. The strongest part of our religion today is its unconscious poetry. Matthew Arnold was a classical critic. He believes in classicism, right? He doesn't believe in romanticism. He caricatured, he criticized, he satirized several romantic poets, though he also appreciated a few. And then to judge a poetry, which poetry is great poetry, which poetry is less great poetry. इसके पहले आने से the essay starts with a very interesting conversation between Saint-Beuve and Napoleon. Napoleon had once said that charlatanism is found in everything. Charlatanism is found in everything. What is charlatanism? Charlatanism means carelessness. बहुत simple से word में आपको बता रहा हूँ. And it is everywhere. And Mr. Saint-Beuve, who was a greater critic, he replied to Napoleon that there might be charlatanism everywhere, but it is not in poetry. Poetry deals with divine subjects, poetry deals with serious subject, and once there is seriousness, how can there be charlatanism? Saint-View replied that charlatanism might be found everywhere else but not in the field of poetry. Why? Because in poetry the distinction between sound and unsound, half sound, truth, untruth, or only half truth, between the excellent and the inferior is of paramount importance. These things are of paramount importance, so there cannot be any carelessness, there cannot be any lack of clarity, any lack of meticulousness, right? Meticulous बिल्कुल होता है, charlatanism बिल्कुल नहीं होता. And for Matthew Arnold, there is no place for charlatanism in poetry. Means Matthew Arnold followed Saint-View in his essay The Study of Poetry. For Arnold, there is no place for charlatanism in poetry. To him, poetry is the criticism of life, governed by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty. Poetic truth and poetic beauty is the part of poetry, and poetry is the criticism of life. This is also a very important question. Who described poetry as the criticism of life? Poetry is the criticism of life according to Matthew Arnold, and in which work he defines poetry? Then the essay on the study of poetry. It is in the criticism of life that the spirit of our race will find its stay and consolation. The extent to which the spirit of mankind finds its stay. This was the opinion of Matthew Arnold about poetry. Right? Saint-View, Napoleon, conversation between them, poetry according to Napoleon, charlatanism is everywhere. Saint-View says it might be everywhere but not in poetry. Matthew Arnold followed Saint-View's. There is no charlatanism in poetry. For Matthew Arnold, poetry is the criticism of life. Alright, these are the points from this slide. And now I come to the point how to judge poetry. Right, what are the parameters to judge poetry? True estimate and then false estimate. Right, the true estimate is called the real estimate, and the false estimates are called the historic estimates and personal estimates. How to judge poetry? According to Matthew Arnold, there are two ways. One is correct ways and another is incorrect ways. Right, there are two types of estimation. Right, true estimation and false estimation. And then false estimation is of two types, personal and historic. The false estimates are called historic estimates and personal estimates, and the true estimate is called real estimate. Alright, according to Matthew Arnold, real estimate is the only true determination of poem's value. Real, that is true. Right, real estimation, that is a true estimation, is the only true determination of poem's value. He also insists that the real estimates determines whether or not a poem belongs to the highest echelon of poetry, believing that only reason to read poetry in the first place is to engage with the greatest works humanity can possibly offer. तो ये उनका कहना है किस चीज पर? ये उनका कहना है true poetry पर. And then he describes the historic perspective and personal perspective. Historic perspective means you are judging a piece of poetry on the basis of dates, on the basis of historical background. And personal estimation means you are judging a piece of poetry on biographical account. And these two estimations are not good for judging a poetry, as Matthew Arnold thinks. Matthew Arnold thinks that historical perspective is never good. The historic estimate of a poem comes from its importance as a historical object. Example वो देते हैं कि this estimate is tied to the poem's place in the development of a language, poetic movement, or various historical events. And these various historical events determine your explanation, determine your interpretation. Arnold makes it very clear that whatever virtues attached to the historic estimate, it must be distinguished from the real estimate, which is timeless. Real estimate is timeless and historic estimation is time bound. Historical background is time bound and poetry deals with universal, and universal means real estimate, that is timeless, that is free from time, that is not in the grip of time, it is universal. Likewise, when he comes on the discussion of personal estimate, he says that personal estimate kahan se aata hai? Personal estimate comes from individual's tastes and preferences. This estimate is tied to the reader's likes and dislikes, right? Considerations that Arnold thinks must be divorced from the kind of considerations that go into arriving at the real estimate of a poem. Suppose that I am from England and Shakespeare is my favorite poet, and if I judge Shakespeare's a poem, Shakespeare's a piece of play, then with reverence I'll be judging him. पूरे respect के साथ में उनको evaluate करूंगा. And if I show my respect to Shakespeare and then judging his piece of work, it will not be the proper judgment. It will not be the disinterested endeavor. That the function of criticism that Matthew Arnold talked about in his function of criticism to the present day. क्या function है? Criticism is a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate. And if I have personal respect, personal biasedness against any poet, then that evaluation, that judgment will be totally personal, and that total personality will not suit to any type of criticism. Alright, historical estimate, personal estimate, and real estimate, that is true estimate, right? There are two types of estimations according to Matthew Arnold, true and false. True estimate is also known as real estimate. Real estimate is timeless, and false estimate is known as historic estimate and personal estimate, and both are bad for the judgment, both are bad for the evaluation of a piece of poetry. Alright, the personal estimate comes from the individual taste and preferences. This estimate is tied to the reader's likes and dislikes. Real estimate is timeless. If a poet is a dubious classic, very important quotation है, अगर कोई poet confused है, if a poet is a dubious classic, तो हमको क्या करना चाहिए? Let's shift him. If he is false classic, then let's explode him. हमको उसे बम से उड़ा देना चाहिए. But if he is a real classic, if his work belongs to the class of very best, then enjoy his work. This is the suggestion of Matthew Arnold. If a poet is a dubious classic, let's sift him. If a poet is a false classic, let's explode him. If a poet is a real classic, then what should we do? Then we should enjoy his work. It means we should enjoy the work of only real classics. If someone is of dubious nature, we should not read his poem, we should not read his work. And if he is a false classic, then we should destroy his work. We should not read his work, we should read only classic works. As in my previous lecture, I had told you that Mr. Matthew Arnold was in favor of classical subject for poetry, not for the contemporary subjects. And Matthew Arnold's criticism developed against the spasmodic school of poets who were in favor of modern subject, who were in favor of extensive use of figure of speech, ornamentation की language. Alright, so this was a true estimation and false estimation. I hope you would have understood the points. Alright, and इसे wish के साथ कि आप समझ गए होंगे. Now I proceed. Now I come to high seriousness. High seriousness is very important topic. Right? Arnold describes an important element that characterizes poems of the highest worth that readers should read. And what are the features, what are the characteristics of that highest worth that readers must learn to recognize? And he calls this element high seriousness. Arnold traces his concept of high seriousness to Aristotle. Right? Aristotle, the father of all critics, right? The father of all sciences. When Mr. Matthew Arnold talks on high seriousness, he traces the root of high seriousness in the work of Aristotle, who valued poetry over history for its higher truth and higher seriousness. Matthew Arnold is somewhat vague about a higher seriousness, right? About the seriousness. Banta kaise hai seriousness? Matthew Arnold is not confirmed. He is a bit vague. He is a bit ambiguous here in this field. But it is clear from an example he gives from Dante's poem, The Divine Comedy, that it involves treating the most important matters. Right? High seriousness means it deals with the most important matters such as fate and free will. And fate and free will are dealt with gravity of the poet who really appreciates the significance of such themes. Right? And only on this ground he criticizes Mr. Geoffrey Chaucer and Robert Burns. Though Geoffrey Chaucer consists of everything that a great poet must have, but only one thing he lacks, and that is high seriousness. And only on that ground Matthew Arnold Matthew Arnold says that Chaucer is not a great poet. Who are the great poets? According to Matthew Arnold, the great poets are Homer, great poets Dante, Shakespeare and Milton. These are the four great poets, four poets of high seriousness in the opinion of Mr. Geoffrey Chaucer. And इसलिए when Geoffrey Chaucer in the opinion of Matthew Arnold, इसलिए जब Matthew Arnold इस बात पर आते हैं अपनी टेस्टामेंट पर, अपने Touchstone method पर, then he talks about only four great classical poets, and four great classical poets come from Homer from Greece, Dante from Latin, Shakespeare and Milton from England. These are the four great poets. And what is touchstone? Touchstone, पीछे बना रहे स्टोन, डायमंड टाइप का स्टोन क्या होता है? बेटर नो, हिंदी में थोड़ा सा बोले पारस पत्थर. Matthew Arnold gives here a way of comparative criticism, right? Comparative criticism की बात करते हैं. If you want to be a great poet, whether your poetry is of great nature, great style or not, then Matthew Arnold says that compare your passage, compare your poems with the poems written by these classics. And if they are fit, if they are compared beautifully, then your poetry is great. And if they are not compared, means your poetry lacks high seriousness and you are not a great poet. This is the Touchstone method. What is Touchstone method? It is a method of comparative criticism where Matthew Arnold talks about four classical writers, Homer, Dante, Shakespeare and Milton, and he gives passages from these four writers and says that these are the lines, beautiful lines, excellent lines, and compare your lines with these lines and then find out the worth of your poetry. If they are equally fit, it means they are worth reading, and if they are not fit, they are not worth reading. This is the Touchstone method. Arnold wrote Arnold talked about this Touchstone method in his analysis of a French critic, and the name of the French critic was Witted. He illustrates his Touchstone method. ये भी एक question नेट का है. Arnold's criticism of Witted illustrates his Touchstone method, his theory that in order to judge a poet's work properly, a critic should compare his passage taken from works of great masters of poetry, that these passages should be applied as touchstone to other poetry. Even a single line, a selected quotation will serve the purpose. Right? Entire poems नहीं compare करना है. Even a single quotation will serve the purpose of comparison. From this we see that he had shifted his position from that expressed in the preface to his poems in 1853. तब इनका पोजीशन दूसरा था, अब यहाँ पर पोजीशन दूसरा है. In the study of poetry, he no longer uses the acid test of accent and architectonics. Right? In preface to poems of 1853, he was talking about the architectonics, he was talking about the acid test, but here he denies those two tests. Here he talks about the comparative method. That comparative method is called Touchstone method of criticism. That is basically a comparative criticism, and here he suggests that compare your poems with a single line of the classical writers or to judge the value, or to evaluate or to know the value of your poetry. Some of Touchstone's जो पैसेजेस हैं जो कोट करते हैं वो होमर से करते हैं. होमर में हेलेन्स वर्ड्स अबाउट हर वुंडेड ब्रदर जूस, addressing the heroes of Peleus, suppliant Achilles words to Priam, and from Dante, Ugolino's brave words and Beatrice's loving words to Virgil. From non-classical writers, he selects from Henry IV Part 2 and then Hamlet. Right? Hamlet absent thee from felicity a while, and then he comes to Paradise Lost, Milton Key, where he gives the line, right? Care sat on his faded cheek, and what is else not to be overcome. These are the patches, these are the lines, right, from the different texts that are made, that are ready, that are worth to be compared. जिनसे आप compare करिए, fit करिए अपनी poetry, and if your poetry fits, then it means your poetry has high destiny. You are a valuable poet. This is all about Touchstone method. क्या याद रखना है आपको? Touchstone method is a method of comparative criticism. Point number 1. Point number 2, Touchstone method happens to appear in the study of poetry, first published in 1880. And point number 3, Homer, Dante, Shakespeare and Milton, these are the 4 great poets जिसको मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड कंपेयर करने के लिए बोलता है. And from Shakespeare he mentions 2 plays, Henry IV Part 2 and Hamlet. And Milton's Paradise Lost, Homer's Aeneid and Homer की Iliad and Odyssey, and Dante's Divine Commedia. These are the texts that are mentioned by Mr. Matthew Arnold for the comparison. That is the Touchstone method of comparison, right? Touchstone method of criticism. All right, any confusion? I hope कि कोई confusion नहीं होगी. And then I come to his study of poetry on Geoffrey Chaucer. I told you about Geoffrey Chaucer. He criticized Geoffrey Chaucer on only one ground, and that one ground is Chaucer lacks high seriousness. Chaucer has all the qualities of the great poets. Only one was that he lacks high seriousness. And why he lacked high seriousness? Because Chaucer was born, Chaucer was influenced, Chaucer was inspired, he was nourished by romantic poetry, right? By romance poetry of the French, and he was influenced by the Italian rhyme royal stanza. There is an excellence of style and subject in his poetry, which is the quality the French poetry lacks. Dryden ने कहा था मिस्टर जेफरी चॉसर के बारे में 2 statements that you have to always keep in your mind, that there are gods plenty in Geoffrey Chaucer's prologue. Here is God's plenty, and he is a perpetual foundation of good sense. This is the quotation of Mr. John Dryden. Right? Dryden says that here is God's plenty, where in prologue to Canterbury Tales and second statement, he is a perpetual fountain of good sense. And Geoffrey Chaucer was called father of English literature by this John Dryden only. According to Mr. Matthew Arnold, there is largeness, benignity, freedom, spontaneity in Geoffrey Chaucer's writing. He is the well of English undefiled. This is the quotation. Who is the well of English undefiled? It is Mr. Geoffrey Chaucer, as Matthew Arnold thinks. He has divine fluidity of movement, divine liquidness of diction. He has created an epoch and founded a tradition of writing his own poetry. Arnold praises Chaucer's excellent style. Arnold praises Chaucer's excellent manner, but says that Chaucer cannot be called a classic. क्यों नहीं कहे जा सकते? Since Chaucer lacks high seriousness. Unlike Homer, Virgil and Shakespeare, his poetry does not have the high poetic seriousness which Aristotle regards as a mark of its superiority over other arts, and Chaucer lacks that art. That's why Chaucer cannot be put in the category of classics. Alright, so this was the study of poetry on Chaucer, and then he comes to the age of Dryden and age of Pope, and Pope and Dryden are described as poets classics, nahi, as prose classics, and Alexander Pope was described as what? Priest, splendid high priest. Right? We are to regard Dryden as the puissant and glorious founder, Pope as the splendid high priest of our age of prose and reason. Splendid high priest of our age of prose and reason, our excellent and indispensable 18th century. Very, very important question. Very, very important question. Who described 18th century as the age of prose and reason? Who described 18th century as our indispensable 18th century? And who described 18th century as the age of prose, right? And who described Mr. Dryden and Alexander Pope as prose classics, right? Who described it was Mr. Matthew Arnold. The age of Dryden is regarded as superior to that of the others for sweetness of poetry. Arnold asks whether Dryden and Pope, poets of great merit, are truly the poetical classics of the 18th century. Then he answers, no, they are not the poetic classics, but in fact they are the prose classics. They are the prose classics. Alright, who? Dryden and Alexander Pope. Right? As for poetry, he considers Thomas Gray to be the only classic of the 18th century. Thomas Gray is considered to be the only classic in 18th century by Mr. Matthew Arnold. Gray constantly studied and enjoyed Greek poetry and thus inherited their poetic point of view and their application of poetry to life, but he is the scantiest, frailest classic since his output was small. He was master in classics, he had studied classics, but his output in the field of classicism is small, is very little. Right, many questions are here in the slide. Once again I recapitulate. According to Mr. Matthew Arnold, Mr. Dryden and Mr. Pope were prose classics, not the poetic classics. Point number 1. Point number 2, 18th century is the age of prose and reason. Point number 3, 18th century is our indispensable 18th century according to Matthew Arnold, and Matthew Arnold says that Pope and Dryden are not poet classics but prose classics, and Matthew Arnold says that Thomas Gray is the only classic of 18th century. Right, Thomas Gray is the only classic of 18th century, but it doesn't mean that he has high seriousness. He also lacks seriousness, and that's why he is not in the top 4 of the classics. All right, the study of poetry on the age of Dryden and Pope, and then the study of poetry on Robert Burns. Who was Robert Burns? Robert Burns was a Scottish poet. He was a Scottish poet. He is known as the plowman's poet. He is known as the national poet of Scotland. And Mr. Arnold says that he is known for Baconian poetry. Right? Burns, although Burns lived close to the 19th century, his poetry breathes the spirit of 18th century life. Burns is most at home in his native language. His poems deal with Scottish dress, Scottish motto, and Scottish religion. Means his poetry is regional poetry. His poetry is not universal. And on this ground, Mr. Robert Burns is summarily rejected. Right? उनको reject कर देते हैं. Categorically, he was rejected by Matthew Arnold as a serious poet. And there are 2 names only mentioned by Mr. Matthew Arnold कि जो seriousness जहाँ पे नहीं है, high seriousness नहीं है, वो Chaucer, and another one was Robert Burns. Like Chaucer, Burns lacks high poetic seriousness, though his poems have poetic truth in diction and movement. Sometimes his poems are profound and heart-rendering. Right? Also like Chaucer, Burns possesses largeness, benignity, freedom, and spontaneity. But instead of Chaucer's fluidity, we find in Burns a springing, bounding energy. Chaucer's benignity deepens in Burns into a sense of sympathy for both human as well as non-human things. But Geoffrey Chaucer's world is richer and fairer than that of Robert Burns. Who is greater? Geoffrey Chaucer. And एक ground पर दोनों failed, that is high seriousness. Alright, study on Chaucer, study on Dryden and Pope, and study on Robert Burns. The study of poetry on Burns. पीछे स्क्रीन पर कुछ दिख रहा है ना? That is Scottish wines. और इनकी जो poems हैं मिस्टर रॉबर्ट बर्न्स की, वो इन दी वर्ड्स ऑफ मिस्टर मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड, उनको बैकेलियन, बैकस वाज द गॉड, राइट, ग्रीक गॉड है, और ही वाज द गॉड ऑफ ड्रिंक, राइट, ड्रंकननेस का जो स्टेट है उस पोएट्री को ग्रेट पोएट्री मानते हैं. द रियल बर्न्स इज ऑफ कोर्स इन दिस स्कॉच पोएम्स. लेट्स बोल्डली से दैट ऑफ मच ऑफ दिस पोएट्री, a poetry dealing perpetually with Scotch drink, Scotch religion, Scotch manners. A Scotchman's estimate is apt to be personal. A Scotchman is used to this word of Scotch drink, Scotch religion, Scotch manners. He has a tenderness for it. He meets its poet halfway. Right? और ऐसा estimation, false estimation हो जाएगा ना. Burns like Chaucer comes short of high seriousness of the great classics and the virtue of matter and manner which goes with that high seriousness is wanting to his work. All right, कोई confusion नहीं. ये पूरी summary थी the essay of the study of poetry की. All right, the study of poetry का total मामला, total content इतना ही था. Right, apart from these essay, apart from this essay, the study of poetry, in the study of poetry he also coins a phrase that is the river of poetry. River of poetry is a phrase coined by Matthew Arnold, and this is a typical question for UGC NET examination. And what does he mean by the phrase the river of poetry? Matthew Arnold uses the word the word river of poetry to refer to the Western tradition of poetry dating from the time of Homer to the present day. Right? There is an ocean of poets. Right, there is a river of poetry, world river of poetry. Right, in Arnold's telling, this great tradition is the mighty river itself, and each national tradition, such as the English tradition, Arnold says, Arnold focuses on the study of poetry is a tributary that feeds the world river. Right, हर जगह से each country, the poetry of each country just plays the role of tributary, and the tributaries come to meet the main river, and that main river is called the world river of poetry. Right, tributary. Arnold's use of this term emphasizes the universal international character of poetry. As he sees it, all human beings can appreciate Homer regardless of what countries they come from, and all human beings can write poetry that will flow into the great world river. In addition, the river flows as the tradition of poetry moves into the future in an unstoppable manner, an idea that symbolically resonates with Arnold's vision for poetry's high destiny. What is the concept of the world river of poetry? The world river of poetry is the tradition of poetry. The entire poetry is considered as a world river, and all the countries, the poetry of the countries are supposedly tributaries. They come to meet to the world river. Right, this was the concept of the world river of poetry. And then there are several essays on several individual poets written by Matthew Arnold, and I have mentioned here two important essays, that one he wrote on P.B. Shelley and one on John Keats. These two essays are not the part of the study of poetry. They were published separately. Right, Arnold on Shelley. Shelley पर क्या मानना है Matthew Arnold का, and I had quoted the lines from Matthew Arnold's essay. What is the opinion of Matthew Arnold about P.B. Shelley? P.B. Shelley को क्या मानते हैं वो? P.B. Shelley, according to Matthew Arnold, is an angel. Right? कैसे फरिश्ते हैं वो? Right? An ineffectual angel. Though he is beautiful and ineffectual angel, beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. Right, his wings are luminous, they are shining, they are brightening, but they are of no use. He is beating his luminous wings in vain. ये important phrase है that is generally asked in examination. It is his poetry above everything else which for many people establishes that he is an angel. Who? Mr. P.B. Shelley. But of his poetry I have not space now to speak, but let no one suppose that a want of humor and a self-delusion such as Shelley's have no effect upon a man's poetry. The man Shelley in very truth is not entirely sane, and Shelley's poetry is not entirely sane either. The Shelley of actual life is a vision of beauty and radiance. Right? This line is very important. The Shelley of actual life is totally different from the Shelley that people think. People think that Shelley was the mad. He was called Mad Shelley by his classmates, as you remember. Right? And actual Shelley jo hai, the Shelley of actual life is a vision of beauty and radiance, but availing nothing, effecting nothing. And in poetry, no less than in life, he is a beautiful and ineffectual angel, beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. This is the statement of Matthew Arnold on P.B. Shelley. And then he comes to the essay on John Keats. He appreciates John Keats, but he depreciates John Keats as well on the ground, on the letters that he wrote to his beautiful girlfriend Fanny Brownie. Right, तो ये mixed type का criticism है. Poetry, according to Milton's famous saying, should be simple, sensuous and impassioned, and on these grounds John Keats is a classical poet. John Keats's poetry has beauty. For John Keats, beauty is truth, truth beauty, beauty is a thing, joy forever. Keats's language is simple and Keats's poetry is impassioned. As had Mr. Wordsworth said, Mr. Milton said, no one can question the eminency in Keats's poetry of the quality of sensuousness. Keats is a sensuousness, a sensuous poet, and nobody can question him. Keats as a poet is abundantly and enchantingly sensuous. This phrase is important, right? Keats as a poet is abundantly and enchantingly sensuous. The question with some people will be whether he is anything else. कुछ और भी है. Many things may be brought forward which seem to show him as under the fascination and sole dominion of sense and desiring nothing better. There is the exclamation in one of his letters, "Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts." And I hope you remember the line when I was dealing with John Keats as a critic. I had mentioned this line from his letter. For a life of sensations rather than of thoughts, there is the thesis. In another, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all considerations. These two quotations are very important. One is, Keats as a poet is abundantly and enchantingly sensuous. Phrase number one. Phrase number two, for Keats, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every considerations, or rather obliterates all considerations. Right, so this was the view of Matthew Arnold on John Keats, and then finally a quotation from Mr. Keats's letter to Fanny Brown. बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग सा quotation है, इसलिए कंक्लूजन के टाइम पर आपके लिए लाया हूं. पीछे देखिए किसका आज है सीन दिखाई दे रहा है. एक हार्ट बना हुआ है, आपका ही है वो शायद, और दूसरा जो है लव लेटर्स. तो दिस वाज अ लव लेटर दैट ही हैड रिटन ड्यूरिंग हिज लास्ट आवर, कह लीजिए लास्ट टाइम कह लीजिए, टू हिज बिलवेड फैनी ब्राउनी. एंड क्या लिखा है उन्होंने कि लव इज माई रिलीजन, लव इज माई रिलीजन एंड आई कैन नॉट लिव विदाउट माई रिलीजन. यू हैव एब्सॉर्ब्ड मी. जैसे किसी का लव लेटर नहीं पढ़ना चाहिए, लेकिन कीट्स का लव लेटर अवेलेबल है, तो लव लेटर लिखना भी सीख लीजिए. यू हैव एब्सॉर्ब्ड मी. I have a sensation at the present moment as though I was dissolving. I should be excusably miserable without the hope of soon seeing you. Means I want to meet you very soon, right? And I should be afraid to separate myself far from you. My sweet Fanny, will your heart never change? My love, will it? I have no limit now to my love. Your note came in just here. I cannot be happier away from you. It is richer than an argosy of pearls. Do not threat me even in jest. I have been astonished that men could die martyrs for religion. I have shuddered at it. I shudder no more. I could be martyred for my religion, and love is my रिलीजन. मैं शहीद हो सकता हूं अपने रिलीजन के लिए, और मेरा रिलीजन क्या है? लव इज माई रिलीजन. आई कुड डाई फॉर दैट. आई कुड डाई फॉर यू. माई क्रीड इज लव एंड यू आर इट्स ओनली टेनेट. You have ravished me away by a power I cannot resist, and yet I could resist till I saw you. And even since I have seen you, I have endeavored often to reason against the reasons of my love. Right? I have always tried, ever since I met you, ever since I saw you, to reason against reasoning. जैसे किंग लियर कहता है, I am sinned against sinning. वैसे ये क्या कह रहे हैं? I have reasoned against the reason of my love, I can do that no more. The pain would be too great. My love is selfish. I cannot breathe without you. तुम्हारे बिना सांस नहीं ले सकता, तुम्हारे बिना रह नहीं सकता, मेरा वो लव है. कभी मुझे मजाक में भी छोड़ने की बात नहीं करना, कभी सेपरेट होने की बात ना करना, मजाक में भी कभी मुझे धमकी नहीं देना, धमकी नहीं देगी ना. ये बात कीट्स अपने लेटर में कर रहा है. कीट्स की पब्लिक लाइफ अलग है और प्राइवेट लाइफ अलग है. और मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड का कहना है कि जो इतना ज्यादा पैशनेट होगा लव में, उसके तो दुर्गति होनी तय है. A man who writes love letters in this strain is probably predestined. One may observe to misfortune in his love affairs, but that is nothing. The complete innervation of the writer is the real point for remark. We have the tone, or rather the entire want of tone, the abandonment of all reticence and all dignity of the merely sensuous man, the man who is passion's slave. Who is passion's slave? The man, John Keats, is passion's slaves in the views of Matthew Arnold. Right, so this was the letter and a specimen of letter that Keats used to write to his beloved Fanny, and this letter has published here. Actually, this letter was quoted by Matthew Arnold in his essay on John Keats, and I have re-quoted from Matthew Arnold's essay here, and then Matthew Arnold's opinion that a person who was writing letters in such a strain was predestined to suffer, predestined to misery, and John Keats was passion's slave in the views of John Keats. Alright? In the views of Matthew Arnold. Right? कोई कंफ्यूजन, कोई इशू, कोई प्रॉब्लम? नो इशू, नो प्रॉब्लम. देन थैंक यू सो मच. आई होप कि वीडियो पसंद आया होगा. पसंद आया होगा तो लाइक करिएगा, शेयर करिएगा, सब्सक्राइब करिएगा, और हाँ, खुद से भी देखिएगा, और एक नहीं कई बार देखिएगा. एक एक पॉइंट एक एक करोड़ के हैं, $1,000,000 पॉइंट है, और जितनी बार देखोगे एक एक पॉइंट विल बी सेट इन योर माइंड, and your mind will open when you will be on the hot sheet, you will be in your examination center. So keep on watching, keep on loving, keep on sharing, keep on working hard, and hard work is key to success. There is nothing in the world who can stop you from your success if you are determined, if you are steadfast, if you have made your mind. Nobody can shake you. कोई आपको डिगा नहीं सकता. Make your mind, prepare yourself, and think 100 times before taking a decision. Once decision is taken, stop thinking and start doing, and that will lead you towards success. Thank you so much. जय हिंद, जय भारत. मिलते हैं जल्दी नेक्स्ट क्लास में. All the best. Good luck.